Please turn to page 87 of the Instruction Booklet.
And welcome back to the Instruction Booklet. As always, I am your host, a man who believes that dragon punching people left and right is the best way to go. It's me, Jeremy, and I'm joined by my host, or my co-host, who thinks that all fighting games should just be grapplers, and that is Michael Pons. Michael, what's up?
You know, it would be one. I mean, just imagine, right? Imagine a world in which it's all grapples. I mean, everything's rock, paper, scissors, but like in an interesting way where, you know, it's like on Wake Up, what is he going to do? Is he going to grab? Is he going to jump?
Is he going to grab again?
Is he going to grab again? Right. Sometimes you got to grab him 3 times in a row.
Maybe that's out there somewhere. You know, somebody's going to listen to this episode and be like, make an entire fighting game of just grapplers.
Exactly. That would be. I'm going to play that fighting game. Let me know if somebody's working on it.
Yeah,
that's my game. Looking forward to Marissa and Geef in this new one. So
yeah. For the folks tuning in, last time you got to hear us talk about the early days of video game history and development, and today we're not doing that. No, because hopefully when this releases, Street Fighter 6 will be out. So we decided we wanted to take a walk down the Street Fighter memory lane. But first, you know, Michael, what you been playing lately, man?
So, I mean, just this past weekend, I was able to get my hands on the Street Fighter 6 beta. So I was playing that pretty much all weekend. Mm-hmm. I've got some thoughts and I'll share those later. But other than that, I've been trying to just continue playing catch up. I just finished playing the original Dead Space, the 2008 one, in preparation for playing the remake, because I really kind of want to refresh myself of what the original game was like before replaying the new one.
Yeah.
I'm finally playing Planescape Torment, and it's slow. It's a lot of reading, but I've got a lot of free time right now, so trying to finally push through so I can say that I did it. And I'm enjoying it. You know, the writing is good quality. Disco Elysium is one of my all-time favorite games, and that's, you know, cites Planescape Torment as being a massive influence. So that's what I've been doing.
People Make Games just put out a video yesterday about Disco Elysium.
Ooh, interesting.
Yeah.
I'll have to check it out.
Cool. That sounds fun. I have obviously been knee-deep in Tears of the Kingdom.
Yeah.
So that has ate up my time, minus the fact I had a small break. But you know, of course, still just pull out the phone when I need to and play some Marvel Snap and all that.
I'm taking a short break from Marvel Snap actually because it's been so frustrating for me. You know.
Well, you're in Infinite now, so
I've hit Infinite 3 times. You know, and so at this point, I'm just I don't know why I feel like I have to prove something to myself. You know.
Yeah. You can play whatever.
Adam Pickens. Some of us don't have, good temperaments for playing multiplayer online games very much, but
he's going to listen to this and throw something at us.
Yeah.
Well, all right. Well, I guess we're going to get into what we're talking about today. We're actually going to go through a kind of loose history of Street Fighter today, like the games. Maybe we're going to touch on a little bit of the pop culture here and there. And we've also going to bring into the idea, running parallel to this narrative, is the fighting game industry, with its whole competitive scene, how Street Fighter kind of helped with the resurgence of, or in creating the FGC, to where it is now. So hopefully this will be a fun episode. We're going to be a little bit more looser than just talking about super boring history stuff. So, but I guess we can start off with the original, the original Street Fighter from August 1987. That was designed by, and I'm sorry if I horribly pronounce any of these, the Takeshi Nishiyama and Hiroshi Matsumoto. It was originally conceived from an early beat-em-up from 1984 called Kung Fu Master, which I downloaded an emulator of and played. And as someone who has played Souls games, I can tell you that arcade games from 1984 are way harder than Souls games. They have no chill. Like, I don't know what to say other than it has 5 levels. I couldn't get through level 2.
All game design is brutal, man.
Man,
but
it's ridiculous.
A lot of them are designed to eat your quarters, right? And that's the thing is,
yeah,
the devs for Dark Souls don't get more money every single time you die. But arcade games,
man, if they did, do you know how much money FromSoft would have?
Dude, they would be a millionaire off of me alone.
Same. These guys played this beat 'em up called Kung Fu Master, and it was also Kung Fu Master was inspired by Bruce Lee's Game of Death, which is kind of hilarious to me when you think about it. Michael, is like every fighting game I think has a Bruce Lee parallel. Like I think he shows up in most fighting games as like a different name or a different character or such.
Liu Kang.
Yeah.
Mortal Kombat.
I can't remember there's the Tekken equivalent, but when Street Fighter has Fei Long.
Is it martial law in Tekken?
I think it is.
Yeah, and then Fei Long. Yeah.
So Kung Fu Master, which was called Spartan X in Japan, was the original idea for Street Fighter. So the bosses in Kung Fu Master, inspired by Game of Death. But following the success of Kung Fu Master, Nishiyama was hired by Capcom to make a sequel to Kung Fu Master called Trojan in '86, which was also a beat 'em up. And it took a lot of the basic ideas of Kung Fu Master and kind of extended on it. Eventually, this led to the creation of actual Street Fighter. And in the arcade version, players, you could only play 2 guys. You could play Ken or Ryu, and you could pick your path, and you had the standard 8-way joystick, and instead of our traditional 6-button, we had 2 large Metatronic pods for punching and kicking that, depending on how hard you hit them, is how you did your light, medium, and heavy. And I attached that photo in the notes for you to see, just so we could the old controls were ridiculous.
Is it how hard you hit them, or is it something about how long you hold it down, like a light tap versus a held tap?
From what I read, it was mostly how hard you could punch them or hit them. So most people would play the game just by beating the hell out of it.
There's no way those cabinets lasted very long, I feel like.
Yeah, well, that's part of why they moved to the 6-button layout eventually.
Yeah, that's right.
They moved to what we know today of the the light, medium, heavy. The first game used it used a lot of, it had special techniques, you still had a Hadouken, a Dragon Punch, a Hurricane Kick. I downloaded the 30th anniversary collection for this and for the episode, and I played the original. And the boss AI in that game is also equally not fair and does things that it shouldn't. So
does it read inputs?
I think it did, but also the damage was just wildly inaccurate.
Okay.
And so, yeah. So the first one was pretty successful. It gave folks a great idea. And then that led us into the sort of weird black sheep that I listed in the notes, which was Street Fighter 2010, released in August 8th, 1990, and in Japan, and then came out in the States in 1990. It is the only Street Fighter title that is a side-scrolling beat-em-up. It was released after Final Fight, which is kind of hilarious because the title is actually Street Fighter 2010 Final Fight, and you play as Ken. So it's kind of interesting how you went from this beat 'em up idea of Karate Champ and Kung Fu Master and Trojan, and it led into this 1v1 game. Then it kind of got quiet for a while, became a side-scrolling beat 'em up, and so it's interesting that or how that early development was. But yet, the foundation was there.
Is it supposed to take place in 2010? Is that why it's called Street Fighter 2010?
Yeah, it's got a cyberpunk futuristic thing.
Oh yeah.
I had to find an emulator of it, and it plays a lot like Final Fight. So, but after August 8th, 1990, we have the thing that's probably going to eat up a large chunk of our beginning conversation, which was Street Fighter 2. Which was released in arcades on February 6th, 1991 in Japan, came in arcades on February 15th, 1991, and then worldwide in March 1991. And then you had the SNES release, which was June 10th, 1992 for Japan, and July 15th, 1992 in North America. And funny enough, this game was released on MS-DOS, the Amiga, the Atari, the Commodore 64, and later the Game Boy.
Game Boy, really? I didn't know that.
Yeah. So could you imagine trying to play a Game Boy version of Street Fighter 2?
I could. It would be difficult, but I could.
Yeah.
That seems fun, actually.
Mm-hmm. So Street Fighter 2 became the best-selling game since the golden age of arcade video games. By 1994, it had been played at least by 25 million people in the U.S. alone. Due to its major success, it would have it had multiple updated versions, which we're going to get into. Worldwide, more than 200 arcade cabinets and 15 million software units were sold of Street Fighter 2, grossing an estimated $10 billion in total revenue, making it one of the top 3 highest-grossing video games of all time as of 2017, and the best-selling video game until 2019.
Till 2019, wow.
Yeah. So, SF2 has a long, long history. It was kind of the game that, as I remember getting it for Christmas, for my Super Nintendo, and just being fascinated by it. And that was for me, that was my introduction to fighting games.
Yeah. Well, I think for a lot of people it was their introduction to fighting games. And I'll sort of jump in here that Street Fighter 2 is largely kind of accredited with being the game that really kickstarted the early fighting game community, at least around Street Fighter. Especially in Japan and then California specifically. It kind of was the case because of how just popular and how, I guess, just common it was to see Street Fighter 2 cabinets in every single arcade. This was the game that people started having weeklies for and tournaments for, and this is where people really started to build the communities around getting together and actually competing to see who was the best. Yeah. So this is really kind of where it starts, rather than Street Fighter 1, as far as the community is concerned.
Yeah, and the competitive scene.
Yeah.
So some kind of fun stuff about it, development took about 2 years. It took 35 to 40 people to help work on it. The producer Funazima notes that developers didn't prioritize balance in the game, which is interesting because if you've ever, as a kid, I didn't notice it. But if you ever go back and play Street Fighter 2, damage values are just absurd. A light fireball could do the same damage as a heavy fireball randomly. Yeah.
Oh, is that the red fireball glitch? That was...
I don't think the red fireball came in until a little bit later, but
okay.
In SF2, you could hit someone with the same fireball twice and have 2 different damage values.
Huh.
Any move in the game had just bizarre damage values. It was so strange. Strangely enough, talking about we mentioned with Final Fight, the success of Final Fight is kind of what helped prioritize the idea. Yoshiniki Okamoto recounts the basic idea at Capcom was to revive Street Fighter. Had a good game concept, but they wanted to make it better in arcade. And as your traditional fighting game, the gameplay wise, it follows, your standard rules of its predecessors. Players engaged in one-on-one close quarters combat, win best 2 out of 3, knock them to 0, or whoever has the highest HP. It'd be the standard for most fighting games, and then Capcom, with the success, would iterate on this as time went on. I guess the hilariousness of Street Fighter II was how combos were originally discovered. I think you've heard that story, right?
Yeah, I've heard it from a few places. I don't remember where exactly I read this or where I heard it, but I know that the story effectively goes something like the first combos that were discovered in Street Fighter II were actually glitches. They were not meant to be in the game. It was sort of a bug that you could actually link two moves together into an unblockable, sort of sequence. I guess an early example of emergent gameplay as far as people discovering tech within games that wasn't intended by the designers. And rather than sort of patch it out of the game, however that would be possible, actually, Capcom, I guess, just decided that, they recognized that people loved it so much. They thought these combos were so cool that it sort of became a staple for the franchise and for fighting games in general. To sort of sell themselves on the idea that you could figure out these sequences of moves that would just, do a lot of damage and look very flashy. So combos, as we know them in fighting games, really kind of began as, unintended design flaws.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I'd listed in the notes, the lead producer noticed the extra strikes were possible during a bug check with the bonus stage. And he thought that the timing required was too difficult to make it useful in the game and just left it in.
Yeah.
Players can't push these buttons that fast.
Right.
So.
Yeah. And now we have, players who dedicate themselves to learning combos with 4 or 5 one-frame links that, are just you have to be a computer to be able to do that kind of stuff. To me, at least. I couldn't imagine being able to do that. So.
As a fun little side note with the Street Fighter II, I guess as I need to mention it, is that the earlier versions of Street Fighter II, Capcom had a system that was used for their arcade system boards called they called it the CP system, and it was mainly used to it was mostly based off of the NES, and then of course upgraded to work better inside of arcades. They developed the CP system hardware for about 2.5 years. Which they developed custom microchips that they called super chips that are equivalent to way more powerful circuit boards. But in the earlier versions, it was plagued with a lot of bootlegs. So, and funny enough, we're going to kind of get into that when we start talking about all these, when what happens when Street Fighter 2 happens, I guess is the best way to say it. And I guess the last note I have about Street Fighter 2, and this comes from our Dark Lord, the editor, who keeps our episodes sounding good, is that in the movie Bloodsport, Jean-Claude Van Damme and Donald Gibb had a scene where they play Data East Corp, and Karate Champ, the game that was heavily influenced, Van Damme is playing that, which is funny because, Van Damme would later go on to play Guile in the 1994 Street Fighter movie. And then Capcom would go on to unsuccessfully sue Data East over similarities of their game Fighter's history to Street Fighter 2. And then it's even funnier now because with the release of Mortal Kombat 1, Van Damme's going to be in the game.
Johnny Cage.
Yeah. Which the splits that Cage does was influenced by Van Damme from Bloodsport. So
there you go.
After
Bruce Lee and Jean-Claude Van Damme now are going to show up in all of the fighting games.
Yeah, we're going to just have to start looking for them. Just turn it into a fun little Easter egg hunt.
Your move, Tekken.
Yeah. So after the massive success of Street Fighter 2, we have Street Fighter 2 Championship Edition, or in Japan, as it was called, Street Fighter 2 Dash. It was released in arcades on March 18th, 1992 in Japan, and then March in 1992 for North America and Europe, and then worldwide in May 13th, 1992. Its console release is kind of interesting because it was only released in the PC engine in Japan, and then later came to the States exclusively to the Sega Mega Drive and Genesis release under the title Special Championship Edition. So it's interesting that like Nintendo had the original Street Fighter 2, and then when Championship Edition came out, it was only to like for like arcades, the PC Engine, and the Sega, which, you know, at the time Nintendo and Sega were like at it. So this was the first of several updates that are to come with Street Fighter 2, though it wouldn't be the last. The main changes being they finally added the 4 boss characters with Balrog, Vega, Sagat, and Bison. The game would actually finally allow mirror matches, because in Street Fighter 2, you couldn't play the same character against one another. There were minor game balances that were put in to further competitive play. So it would make sense that Capcom was probably watching, I guess, some of the competitive scene around that time. And they polished up some of the animations and improved some of the character portraits. Success-wise, Championship Edition earnings would exceed $2.3 billion in gross revenue, making it one of the top 3 highest grossing arcade games of all time, after Pac-Man and Space Invaders. Is
that adjusted for inflation? Do you know, or?
I'm not quite sure. I should probably look into that. But I was
be a lot of money for the 90s.
I was shocked behind Pac-Man and Space Invaders, So then after Championship Edition, I guess we talk about I can talk about the weird thing where I was just talking about bootlegs. So
sure.
In 92, a group of Taiwanese hackers called Hung Hisai Enterprise Taiwan bootlegged a copy of Street Fighter 2 and created Rainbow Edition. And it added a lot of features that weren't present in Championship Edition, including Ken and Ryu being able to use their special moves 5 times in quick succession. To me, the most broken thing, Guile's Sonic Boom had homing properties.
Oh no.
And many special moves could be done in the air. Players could also press start to change their character mid-match. How about...
Oh my gosh.
Could you imagine that for like a competitive scene?
Yeah, I mean, would it pause the game, or would
I've watched a few videos, but I never saw anybody doing the character swap.
Okay.
But I will say homing Sonic Booms were bonkers.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just thinking you play a rushdown character, like someone who's really good at getting in close like Ken, and then you just swap to Geef. Mm-hmm. I mean, there's just got to be some insane, tick throw setups that you can do that require hot swapping to Geef in the middle of a combo string.
Yeah. The game was also played at higher speeds, which was kind of like a standard for moving forward, as we're going to see a lot of Street Fighter 2 with faster move sets. Rumors from Capcom over with hyper fighting was due to the popularity of Rainbow. Players would note that the similarities between the two titles. In an article with Polygon, James Goddard, who was the design support for Turbo, said development on Turbo started after he played Rainbow and then told Capcom that they needed to do an update to compete.
Nice, that makes sense.
So it's interesting that a hacked version of Street Fighter, which apparently there were tons of them, but Rainbow was kind of the one that kind of came to the surface as the it factor.
Mm-hmm.
So then after that, we get Street Fighter 2 Turbo Hyper Fighting, not to be confused later when we start talking about Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. The Street Fighter 2 era, it's so funny and weird. Street Fighter 2 Turbo Hyper Fighting was released in arcades on December 10th, 1992 in Japan, and then worldwide on December 21st, 1992. Its console release was for the SNES on July 10th, 1993 in Japan, and then August 1st, 1993 in the US. It's the third arcade release of Street Fighter 2. It was much faster playing speed, and new special moves for certain characters were added, as well as further refining character balance. Turbo is the final arcade version of Street Fighter 2 using the original CP1 system. I actually have a copy of Street Fighter 2 Turbo Hyper Fighting in my SNES right now.
Wow, nice.
I remember as a kid playing this game, being excited because that was the game that gave Chun-Li her fireball. I was a big Chun-Li main in Street Fighter 2.
Nice.
Because I loved jumping off walls. After this, we get Super Street Fighter 2: The New Challengers, which was kind of a very interesting upgrade for a lot of the game. Its arcade release was September 10th, 1993 in Japan, and then September 11th, 1993 in the US. It was released on the SNES and the Sega Mega Drive and the Genesis on June 25th, 1994 in Japan, and July 18th, 1994 in North America. It was also released on the Amiga and MS-DOS. I'm just having a copy of Windows 95 and thinking about trying to play a Street Fighter game on MS-DOS. It's just mind-boggling to me.
Yeah.
This was the fourth game in the Street Fighter 2 sub-series. Following the release of Street Fighter 2 Turbo Hyper Fighting, this version refines balance of the existing characters' rosters from previous versions and introduces 4 new characters. It was also the first game using the CP2 system, so it looked a little better, played a little better. It also featured a scoring system for combos, also featured first attack bonuses, reversals, as well as recoveries. The faster speeds from Turbo Hyper Fighting was reduced a little bit, so the game plays a little bit closer to SF2. And it was also the first version to be released with a tournament battle version that allowed single elimination tournaments. So here's like Capcom finally like submitting to like the idea of competitive tournaments and including it inside their systems. It's like kind of like old LAN networks, which I don't know. You've seen pictures of what like Japanese arcade cabinets look like, right?
Yeah.
Where they actually have like a seat on them.
Yeah.
Compared to American arcade cabinets where you just have to stand the entire time. So it was definitely like kind of an interesting like push, and I'm sure this definitely would have helped the competitive scene a lot more now. After that, we have the one that's kind of the biggest one and almost like the swan song of the SF2 era, which was Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo. It was released in arcades February 23rd, 1994, globally. There wasn't a separate release on this one. And it was released on consoles November 1994, only for the 3DO, MS-DOS, and the Amiga. Which is still just hilarious to me because it's like the Street Fighter 2 genre jumps around consoles so much.
Mm-hmm. Well, the console markets, in the 80s and 90s were still so volatile. I mean, It's easy to think, if you're somebody who grew up playing video games from the early 2000s onward, of course, that it's, Nintendo, Microsoft, and Sony. But with so many people, and we'll kind of talk about this next month when we do more video game history, but so many industries and companies were trying to get in on the video game industry that it's like every single tech company that, you and your grandmother knew was, they had a console at the time.
Right.
So it is kind of funny to see how that affects a popular game with so many different iterations.
So this was the 5th installment of SF2 subseries. Super Turbo introduced several new gameplay mechanics not present in previous versions of SF2, including addition of combination moves called super combos and air combos. Also introduced the first secret character in Akuma, who would go on to become a recurring character later in the series. And I think we talked about him a little bit in our Easter egg episode where you had to beat the entire game without any continues. And at the end, he comes out and like wrecks Bison and you have to fight him. And funny enough, he didn't have a picture portrait. And you could do like some shenanigans to unlock him and he would just replace Ryu's character portrait. While it wasn't a commercial success as previous iterations, the game had a huge impact on the competitive fighting game circuit. To this day, Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo is still played competitively and is the oldest fighting game that still has an active competitive tournament throughout the world. And I remember there being like some exhibitions at EVO from time to time with Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo. So it's kind of interesting that this game still, this was the game that sort of introduced super moves, but instead they were like super combos. You actually had like a meter at the bottom as well.
Yeah, I think Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo was also one of the games featured at the first 2 or 3 Battle by the Bays.
Yep.
The tournament that a lot of people nowadays know as EVO, the Evolution Championship Series, one of the biggest fighting games in the world, or fighting game sort of events, tournaments of in the world. And yeah, among other Street Fighter games that were popular at the same time, versions of Street Fighter 2 and the Alpha series. Street Fighter 2 Turbo was one of the main games played at these early competitions.
Yeah. And then I have to throw it in here just because I'm thinking about it and of course 1994 was the Street Fighter movie featuring
Nice.
Jean-Claude Van Damme and Kylie Minogue and Raul Julia as Bison, that also had an arcade release that decided that they wanted to steal the idea from Mortal Kombat and used motion capture from the actors of the movie. And it was terrible.
Yeah, I'm sure that looked great.
They released a home console version of it that used the turbo engine and that apparently played a little bit better, but for the most part it was just awful.
Yeah.
So with the end of Super Street Fighter 2, we move into kind of a new era for Street Fighter. Well, we had and it's funny enough is it's just a 1-year gap between Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo and what would come next, which was Street Fighter Alpha. Warrior's Dreams, or in Japan known as Street Fighter Zero. I actually never played the Alpha games on release. I wasn't a PlayStation kid. So I only got to recently play the Alpha games maybe within the last month when I bought the 30th anniversary collection. And I was like, well, I need to, learn what these games are like. This game was released in June 1995 for Japan and North America. It was the first new Street Fighter release since SF2 in 91. It started life in October in 1994 after the release of another Capcom game that is dear to my heart in Darkstalkers. The development team was only given 3 months to complete a game from scratch, but ended up completing development 6 months after production was started. The original title for the series was supposed to be called Street Fighter Legends, and to give an idea of what kind of roster they were working with, this name would later be used in a comic book adaptation. The prototype for the game for Street Fighter Classic, since it was meant to take place between the original Street Fighter and SF2, the Japanese name for the game was Zero, but Capcom PR in North America disliked it and thought it sounded kind of negative, so they renamed it to Alpha. After its release in Japan, it went on to become the second most popular arcade game in the month, right behind Virtual Fighter 2. So it's kind of interesting that the 3D fighting genre has already started now. And I'm guessing we have your Virtual Fighters and Tekken is around that time.
Mortal Kombat 2 was sort of dipping their feet in. It might have been a little bit later than this, but MK had its.
What was that, Mortal Kombat
3D
3?
era.
No, Mortal Kombat. Was it 4 that was the first 3D Mortal Kombat? It was fully 3D because you had weapons and stuff.
Yeah.
Alpha revamped the Super Combo system that started in Super Turbo, and like in Super Turbo, the Super Combo gauge that fills for the players to perform regular and special moves. And then when gauge reaches a level, you can perform 1 or higher to do super combos. Additionally, Alpha was the first game to introduce counters into the game, where players could perform these by using their super gauge to perform counter attacks after blocking. This game is also interesting, and what we were talking about before the episode started about some of the stuff with 6, doing new things, is this game introduced auto and normal playstyles, where auto allowed players to perform instant super combos by pressing punch and kick at the same time. So it's interesting to me that that is, here's the kind of the beginning of Capcom going, look, we want our players to be able to do these cool fancy things, but we need to find easier ways for them to do them.
Yeah. It'll be interesting to sort of talk about the parallels between that, because Capcom's been trying that kind of stuff, with like the Versus Series 2. I'm pretty sure Ultimate Marvel versus Capcom 3 had like a similar style input selection, and we'll talk about Street Fighter 6 a little bit later, but they've always really kind of been committed to this problem of how do you get casual players to experience kind of some of the cooler stuff that they see advanced players doing,
Yeah. It kind of runs into like the problem that the FGC was having for a while, where it was like they wanted new players, but the bar was becoming so high for new players to get into it.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems as though that has changed in the last few years. Like we've seen a lot of fighting games move towards easier introduction points. I had never played a Guilty Gear before I played Strive.
Yep.
And then like you had like DNF, and DNF was a really good jumping on point for people.
Yep. So. Grand Blue Fantasy. I mean, Arcs. I guess we just named three Arxis games. But,
yeah.
Arxis is an interesting example of a dev who's really kind of trying to go in the direction of easy to learn, difficult to master, and I think that Street Fighter 6 is probably moving a little bit in that direction too.
Yeah.
Which is cool to see. I think more people playing these games is a good thing. Not everything needs to be like, ridiculous input heavy Fist of the North Star nonsense.
Right.
So
after the release of Alpha, you had Alpha 2, which was in February 27th, 1996. It had a console release for PlayStation, Saturn, and SNES and Windows, all ranging from August 9th down to November 1st. This game is a remake of Alpha. It featured a number of improvements over the original, such as new attacks, stages, endings. The main new system was the inclusion of the custom combo system, which replaced chain combos from Alpha. It kept the original roster of 13 from Alpha, added in Dhalsim and Zangief, and Gin, who was an assassin from the original Street Fighter. He's like the second guy you fight, and he just spams ninja stars. Rolento, a member of the Mad Gear gang, who originally appeared in Final Fight. So now we've kind of started working the Final Fight stuff into Street Fighter. As well as the newcomer, who I also know she's super popular, is Sakura.
Nice.
So funny enough is that Alpha 1 didn't get as much praise as people would think, because its console release was the games were bundled together. Alpha 1 and Alpha 2. Or no, wait, I don't think Alpha 1 and Alpha 2. It was the third strike games, I think, that were bundled together. So
yeah. And
then after Alpha 2, then we kind of have some of the beginning stuff. This was the first Battle of the Bay, right?
Yep. B3, Street Fighter Alpha 2 was one of the major games, both at B3 and B4, and this was also the first appearance of Alex Valle, one of sort of like the all-time greats of American FGC scene. Apparently, this is where he debuted a unblockable combo that he had been labbing in order to actually win the grand finals for Street Fighter Alpha 2, which has now been dubbed the Valle CC, from what I hear.
Okay. So after Alpha series, after Alpha 2, we have Street Fighter 3, the new generation. This was released on February 28th in arcades in 1997, and then it was a console release in December 16th, 1999 on Dreamcast. It was released featuring Capcom's new CP3 system. It was a direct sequel to SF2, though the game initially discarded every previous character except for Ryu and Ken, and introduced an all-new roster. It featured several new abilities and features, some taken from Capcom's other fighting games titles, such as the aforementioned Darkstalkers, which is a game I really, really love. Players can perform quick dashes forward and backwards, super jumps, quick stands, or known as teching, will be known as teching from like throws after falling from an attack. Lifted out of X-Men Children of Atom. The game also introduced leaping attacks, as well as players could parry attacks. It also featured Super Arts, which is a powerful special move similar to a Super Combo. Players could select their Super Arts after selecting their character, and like the Super Combo gauge, Super Arts had their own separate gauge. So 3 was like I remember hearing about it. I never got to play it when it came out, but I remember 3 being contentious because of, you just drop the entire roster. Except for Ryu and Ken. So, and I remember
it's a weird roster.
Yeah, but strangely enough, a lot of those characters today are more like beloved.
Right, a lot of them ended up becoming fan favorites.
So then this led us into Street Fighter 3 Second Impact Giant Attack, which was released September 30th, 1997 in arcades, and December 16th, 1999 on Dreamcast, which is the same date as the original Street Fighter 3, because the console release of these games were grouped together. SF3 and Second Impact releases a double pack, which seems like an odd choice, right? Like, why would you package 2 games together like that for a console release? So, especially 2 years after the release of both games. So, it was an updated version of SF3, and like its predecessor, it ran on the CP system hardware. 2, and then Second Impact introduced new gameplay mechanics, new characters, special moves. It is the only CP2 game to have a widescreen feature. Standard balances in the game were made, as well as other things, including the introduction of the EX special moves, where players could use part of their super art gauge to create more powerful versions of their standard attacks. Tech throws, the ability to escape from throw attacks, were put in the game as well. So you start seeing like some of the stuff here that's like more staples of what we know today as fighting games. EX moves, I think, are everywhere now. Like, most games have like an EX move.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say.
And then, so then we're in here in like 1998. We have, instead of what you would think would be another follow-up Street Fighter 3, they jump back to the Alpha series and released Street Fighter Alpha 3 or Street Fighter 03, which was released on arcades in June 29th, 1998, with a console release of December 23rd for PlayStation, as well as Dreamcast and Sega Saturn. It was the 3rd installment of the Alpha series, and Alpha 3 serves as a sequel to Street Fighter Alpha 2 and ran on the CP System 2 hardware as previous Alpha games. The game was produced after Street Fighter 3 sub-series started, but before the release of Third Strike. Alpha 3 discarded the auto and manual feature from the previous Alpha games and instead offers 3 different playstyles known as isms for the player to choose from. And then each style was unique to previous takes on previous systems, including Alpha 2 and Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo, providing players with different approaches of how they wanted to play based on experience and comfort level. Alpha 3 also introduced the Guard Power Gauge, a system that depletes the bar each time player blocks. And if the gauge is completely depleted, the player will remain in a vulnerable attack state. So Alpha 3 is kind of interesting to me from the perspective of them offering players different ways to play based on what version of the game that they've played. So, and then I also think, isn't here in 98 the other big Evo stuff?
Yeah, Alpha 3 is a very important game in the history both of Street Fighter and kind of the FGC as a whole. This was kind of the moment here in the late 90s that Capcom itself really started taking, I think, a vested interest in organizing FGC events. I think it was in 1998, after having sort of 2 national tournaments, one in Japan, one in the US, that Capcom actually organized a Street Fighter Alpha 3 World Championship. And this was one of the first times that Alex Faye, who was the North American champion, and Daigo Umehara, who was the Japanese champion, they had a match in California, I believe. That you can go online, actually, and you can find the video from 1998. It's not a great quality video, but, you know, it's a kind of momentous occasion in the history of the fighting game community, so it's cool little set to watch.
Oh, sweet. Well, then I guess that leads us into the beloved Street Fighter third game, with Street Fighter 3 Third Strike, Fight for the Future, released in arcades on May 12th, 1999, with a console release of June 29th, 2000 for the Dreamcast. It was a follow-up to the other sub-series for SF3 games. It was running on the new CP3 system which added further refinements to the previous gameplay mechanics and rules. The game was well received of all of its versions and have since been regarded one of the greatest fighting games of all time.
I think IGN actually put it at the top of their list.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Yeah, the game balance is more fine-tuned and the sprites were reworked. Upon release, it was the most successful arcade game of 1999, and though not particularly popular at its release. With now Third Strike being highly regarded in fighting game communities as one of the best fighting games. It also being the game that created the now famous Evo Moment 37. Which also is considered the most iconic moment of competitive gaming and inspired many to start playing Third Strike.
Yeah, one of the most iconic moments in the FGC as well as esports in general.
Yeah.
Where, Daigo does the impossible and parries the full Chun-Li super, like, what is it? It's like 12 or 13 parries and then confirms into his own combo, winning the set.
Yeah, it's ridiculous. And it was Justin Wong and Daigo, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
And I'm pretty sure one of the reasons that I was reading why Street Fighter 3 Third Strike was just like not that successful. I mean, like, it was well regarded, but it wasn't as popular as some of the other games. Mm-hmm. Was because a lot of the other games at the time, like, people were really interested in 3D graphics, especially here in the late 90s. And it seemed like kind of a step backwards to be making, stylized, fully 2D games still.
Right.
And I just think it's funny because I remember hearing about this and thinking about it from a perspective of, here in 2023, it looks so much better than so many of the other games that came out around the same time. I think primarily because they chose to go with the 2D art style instead of the 3D art style. I mean, so many old 3D games from like the 90s and the early 2000s look horrible.
Yeah.
Whereas the 2D sprites actually still look great because, the art is just good.
Well, and, that kind of touches on back in 96, Capcom decided to try and do something like that because they made the Street Fighter EX games, which were full 3D Street Fighter games. And if you go and see any of the images from those, that game looks rough. In fact, EX3 would come back after Third Strike. So then we have the gap that happens. Third Strike came out in 1999, and Street Fighter 4 wouldn't come out till 2008. So that's quite the gap.
Decade.
Yeah. And for me, this was when I got back into Street Fighter because I didn't get to play any of the Alpha series, any of the Street Fighter 3 games, any of that stuff because I didn't play a PlayStation. And I remember
I think Street Fighter 4 was probably the first Street Fighter that I played, I think.
Yeah. So Street Fighter 4 came out in arcades July 18th, 2008, and then it came out on console for PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 on February 12th, 2009, and July 2nd, 2009 for Windows. It was the first original series since 1997's Street Fighter 3, a hiatus of 11 years. Producer Yoshinori Ono stated that he wanted to keep the game closer to SF2. The game had a similar feel to Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo, but also included some things from Third Strike. It had a new system called the Focused Attack system, as well as Ultra Moves. The traditional 6-button scheme returned with new features and special moves. Before the idea of SF4 was pitched, the prevailing attitude around Capcom was that a new numeric entry in the Street Fighter series would not be made. The gap from 2000 to 2008 represented the longest time the series had gone without a sequel. However, in light of fan demand, plus a positive reception of Street Fighter 2 Hyper Fighting release on Xbox Live, eventually the project began. Yoshinori Ono was the sound manager for Third Strike and previously produced Capcom Fighting Jam. This was his first time producing a full Street Fighter entry, and the original game concept was supposed to be titled Street Fighter 4 Flashback. The game would feature 2.5D graphics as a roster made from the classic FF2 characters, plus Sakura and a few new characters. The Flashback game was supposed to feature a single-player mode with a third-person action focused on Ryu's backstory. as well as all the Street Fighter arcade games in their original forms and a 3D version of Super Turbo. So, you know how weird that would be to be playing like a 3D action game where it's just Ryu reliving his past.
Yeah, that seems interesting. Very Shaolin monks.
Yeah. The game was released to huge success and received universal acclaim. An arcade version of the game was voted Best Game of 2008. The game also won the category of Best Graphics, Best Production, and a Reader's Choice Award by the Japanese magazine Arcadia. Ryu took the number 1 spot as the top 20 characters of 2008, and the game also won Fighting Game of the Year at the Video Game Awards. So, you know, SF4 was a big deal. Like, I remember it coming out and being very excited and getting to play it. That was also my introduction to competitive fighting games as well. Because I watched. I think
it holds up pretty well too. I mean, I think the focus attack system mechanic is very cool. I know a lot of people still prefer parrying from Street Fighter Third Strike, but I think focus attacks. I mean, they became pretty iconic. I think for the series too. When Ryu and Ken showed up in Super Smash Bros. Ultimate, I think their down special was a focus attack, including the ability to dash cancel it the same way you can in Street Fighter 4.
Yeah. Now, something talking about the competitive scene. So I've been mentioning as the game's released that there's like an arcade release and a console release. And the reason I've been doing that is because it's interesting. I found this out when I started watching competitive games that people would go and live in Japan to play the arcade releases before the console releases came out. So they could learn like all the new versions of the game. Like people would just actively go live in Japan when like a new version of Street Fighter 4 would come out. So
that's some dedication.
Yeah, extreme dedication. Beyond that, we had Super Street Fighter 4, which had a console release in April 27th, 2010. It was deemed too large to be a DLC. Super Street Fighter 4 was released as a standalone title, but giving a lower price than full retail. It's an updated version of SF4 and deemed the end of the SF4 series. And thus we come to the last full release one, the one that, surprisingly enough, has the most bizarre amount of information, and by that I mean none whatsoever, was Street Fighter V, released in arcades on March 14th, 2019, as well as consoles on February 16th, 2016. It eventually had an arcade edition release on January 16th, 2018, and a championship edition February 14th, 2020. So I remember being excited about Street Fighter V, and then it came out.
Yeah. And I think that describes the experience of a lot of people.
It was a dud.
Street Fighter V. I have strong memories of early Street Fighter V. One of my roommates at the time because I was an undergrad when this game came out, and so I had a roommate who was deeply involved in sort of the local FGC, and I remember being excited for the game. I really liked a lot of the design of some of the new characters. I thought Nikali looked really cool.
The dude with all the hair.
Yeah, the hair, like he goes into this insane, like Super Saiyan form, when he uses his V-Trigger. V-Trigger, that was something that the game introduced, which is an interesting mechanic. I mean, I like options as far as games are concerned. And so I don't feel strongly either way about the V-Trigger system. I thought it was fine.
Yeah.
But I remember playing the beta, and I remember just there's being so many issues as far as the netcode had problems. There was no training mode in the beta, which like really kind of rubbed me the wrong way, because I'm somebody who, when I get my hands on a new fighting game, the first thing I want to do is sit in the lab for like 3 hours.
Just experiment.
There's still a lot of clipping problems with the graphics. Like I remember like Birdie's chain going through like, the upper portion of his chest and his clothes, and Nikali's hair. I'm not sure they ever really made it look right as far as the way it just sort of clips through things.
Yeah, and this was the game that was a Sony PlayStation exclusive.
Yeah, that rubbed a lot of people the wrong way too.
Well, and that was kind of, it's interesting in hindsight now because Sony owns Evo. After what happened, was it last year before last, where they had They had the director of Evo step down due to
Mr. Wizard. Yeah. Due to some stuff that you can.
You can Google it.
Dear listeners, you can go look it up on your own time if you want. But
yeah, and Sony swooped in and just bought Evo out. So it's interesting that they tried to corner the market on Street Fighter V. And eventually it had like a Windows release. So yeah, that kind of is a quick and dirty history of everything leading up to what will be on June 2nd of 2023 is the release of Street Fighter 6, which so far, having played the demo, I'm very excited about it.
I'm very excited about it, and I think I mean I haven't seen very many people with negative opinions about the gameplay. I mean, everybody who I know who's gotten their hands on it can't stop talking about how fun it is. Mm-hmm. And I concur. I mean, I think it feels great. Yeah,
they got some new people working on it because the previous director had some interesting ideas.
Yeah,
they let him go, and these new guys that they brought in, you can tell they really have a lot of love and appreciation for Street Fighter.
Yeah, I think the new system mechanics are very exciting. I like the drive gauge system a lot, in that it gives you a kind of balanced. I guess we'll see if it's balanced, but kind of a risk reward dynamic to the gameplay of, you can spend a lot of your drive gauge doing EX moves, either for extra damage in your combos, setups, pressure, that kind of stuff. But you run the risk of exhausting yourself and leaving yourself open to a potentially like deadly sort of counter offensive if your opponent takes advantage of your low drive gauge and catches you in the corner and hits you with an impact.
Yeah.
And I'm glad that EX moves have been separated from super meter. This is something that I was talking to you a little bit earlier about, but personally, like, I remember being like, not that I'm a super experienced fighting game player or anything, but I remember being a more casual player. I think actually one of my favorite fighting games when I was younger was the original Injustice. I like NetherRealm games. And I love all the super moves that were in the game. I love how characters' personalities kind of get shown in these short little cutscenes that happen when your character gets to do a cool super move.
Yeah.
And something that always disappointed me in a lot of these games is that it was always just like suboptimal play for you to use a super move. Like especially in something like MKX, for instance, it's like, why would you ever use your fatal blow if it's going to take up all of your meter? You need that for your combo breakers. You need that for your invincible wake up reversals. It's like, I'm glad that more recent games have decided, actually, let's take supers and let's put them in its own separate thing, right? So like, you don't have to make a choice between using your resources on a super or something else. You can just do both.
Right.
MK11, they tied it to health, which is something that Street Fighter 4 did with its ultra gauges, which I thought was a cool decision. But Street Fighter 6 goes all the way and just says, okay, EX moves just tied to your drive gauge now.
Right.
Which is something that'll just regenerate over time, or with parries, or but if you want to use a super move, you have its own dedicated resource for that, which I think is cool. I appreciate that.
Yeah, and with parries are now back. They were gone in 5. Now they've returned as they're like their own system now too. And another thing that something that immediately got my attention when they first announced this game was with the Battle Hub. The fact that there are old arcade cabinets with older Street Fighter games that have their own online matchmaking.
Yeah.
And I was like, why have you not been doing this?
I was thinking about mentioning that earlier because what's interesting is in game there are daily missions that you can do and weekly missions that give you in-game currency that you can use to customize your avatar, that you use to run around in the Battle Hub. And during the beta, some of the missions that I was getting were actually related to going into this classics arcade section and actually doing daily challenges for whatever the game of the day was.
Nice.
And for one of the days of the beta, it was actually Street Fighter 2.
Nice.
which was cool. I got to play around a little bit. I was very bad at it. Plays very differently, obviously, than like a modern Street Fighter game, but it was very cool to see.
Yeah, I did the 30th anniversary collection and played a lot of it over the last month, and girlfriend would watch me play it, and she'd be like, "You're bad at this." I'm like, "No, the computer is just ridiculously hard."
Yeah,
and also I'm not used to playing like this. That, just making excuses, but playing old fighting games is so different compared to like when you're playing more modern stuff now. Yeah,
it really is a whole different ball game.
Yeah, for the most part, I'm excited for 6. I guess what you're looking forward to Marissa and Zangief the most.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to Marissa and Geef, obviously. Mm-hmm. The one thing that concerns me / excites me about potentially playing Zangief in Street Fighter 6 is one of the biggest, I guess, design choices that has a lot of people in the FGC talking right now is modern controls versus classic controls.
Right.
Classic controls, you know what to expect. It plays like Street Fighter 4 or 5. You have all of your buttons. You have your 6 buttons. You have your special moves. You do your inputs to get your special moves and your supers. Modern controls are Capcom's latest attempt at making sort of an alternative control scheme to help newer players sort of jump right in and start playing the game and do the inputs for things, basically by replacing inputs for supers and specials with one button. And I think it's very easy to underestimate how difficult some of these inputs are for newer players. I mean, it sort of comes as second nature if you've been playing these games for years, to know how to do a quarter circle, to know how to do a Z input for Dragon Punch, to know how to do even a half circle or a full 360 if you're a Geef player and you need to do your command grabs.
Yeah.
But I had friends in undergrad who literally just couldn't reliably do quarter circle inputs to save their lives. They would try and throw a Hadouken and they would end up jumping almost every single time somehow in an input that doesn't even require you to press up.
Yeah.
And so, I've heard people describe it as, playing almost like Super Smash Brothers, right? Where you just, you get the special move by just pressing a button and a direction. And there are trade-offs for this. The most notable of which is like a 20% damage debuff. You do less damage if you're playing on modern controls. That's how it was in the beta, at least. We'll see if Capcom tweaks anything between the beta and the official release.
Right.
But also, it can be a little bit more difficult to pull off some of your normals. Mm-hmm. I think a lot of the normal moves get covered up by special moves, like they just have their buttons taken. And you can still do them, but it requires that you actually hold another separate button that's, I think, called like the assist button that allows you to then do your normal moves regularly.
Okay.
But I know what has a lot of people talking, and I know already apparently that some very prominent FGC players from Japan specifically are talking about how they're going to be using modern controls in 6. One button specials and supers, and also auto confirms from combos.
Yeah,
look very strong. People are talking about the fact that you can reliably, you see your opponent go for a drive impact, cool, one button super. It's like you can't, as a human being, reliably buffer your super input every single time, like if you expect your opponent to make a mistake. And you can't do it without also telegraphing. If you're sitting in the corner and your character starts teabagging, okay, this person's trying to buffer a super.
Right.
But now reliably, it's like, oh, my opponent jumped. Cool. I'm going to go for my Shoryuken super. Mm. On top of that, the sort of the auto confirms that modern controls give you as far as basic combo inputs go will even take into consideration things like whether or not you're getting a punish or a counter hit.
Yeah.
It takes the extra frame data into account, such that I've seen clips of Ryu, getting punish confirms on an auto combo that turns into an EX donkey kick and gives him a full combo off of it.
Wow, that's crazy.
Yeah, versus the same version of the auto combo, but not a counter hit. that the game automatically confirms into like Tatsu, which is I think safe on block.
Yeah.
So it's actually kind of insane that the computer will just like auto complete your combos for you in such a way that requires very little risk on your part, because the game knows if you're going to be safe or if you have the possibility to extend into a full combo.
Okay.
That being said, who knows if 20% less damage is worth it. I mean, I guess we'll have to see. But the prospect of being able to play Zangief, right, sort of coming back to these characters that I'm excited for, the prospect of being able to play Zangief and get command grabs with one button is pretty interesting.
Okay.
I know it has some people concerned. I think I'm probably a little bit concerned about it, but who knows?
Yeah, we'll see. Well, cool. Well, I think that's about it for our episode.
What characters are you excited for?
For me, Cammy. Yeah. I'm really excited for Cammy. Sure. She looks awesome. I'm super pumped for her, and I like Chun-Li. I'm mostly excited for most of the cast.
Chun's cool. Chun's difficult. I don't know if you played her at all during the beta.
Yeah.
She is quite technical in this game, and I think it's largely due to the fact actually she's got a stance now.
Yeah.
And a lot of the moves that she can do out of her stance are actually special cancelable.
Oh.
Which opens up some crazy, confirm and block string options for her and mix up options. She's got some overheads out of her stance. She's got some lows out of her stance.
Sweet.
Anti-airs. It's really cool.
But yeah, now I've got the day off, so I'll be playing it all day, and I'm ready to dive into it. So, but yeah, I think we're gonna wrap it up and do our plugs real quick. But
I'll say too, there's a lot more games we could have thrown in here. I think if we were trying to cover if crossovers,
and we might be able to get into that later in our episodes. So
the Marvel versus Capcoms and the Street Fighter cross Tekkens and the Tatsunokos versus Capcoms and the Street Fighter cross X-Men or versus X-Men or whatever the middle of the road games. Yeah.
Well, cool. Well, if you've made it through our entire episode of just listening to us ramble on about Street Fighter, next month's episode we're going back to our history. We're going to be talking about the rise of Atari and the early days of the home consoles. So it should be fun. And other than that, Michael, where can the folks find you online?
I'm on Twitter and Instagram. I believe my handles are both mackerel_prawns, meant to sound like the aquatic animals that they sound like.
Yeah.
Actually, my Twitter handle doesn't have an underscore.
Okay.
But my Instagram one does. So
yeah, you can find me on twitch.tv/backwardshero. I'm on Instagram and Facebook as PressArtF4. I'm also on Cajun Greatness when we have a new episode. We've been kind of lacking lately. You can also find this show as the Instruction Booklet on Facebook, all one word. And we also have a link tree, linktr.ee/Instruction Booklet. Has all of our stuff that we just mentioned, as well as a nice little player for you to listen to our new episodes. And also, of course, we have the AOICH extra stuff that, we're thankful that they let us do this show. You can find them on SoundCloud, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and they have Twitter at AYCH Podcast and at AYCH Extra. So yeah, thanks for listening, and hopefully everybody gets to play some Street Fighter 6.
Yep. Thanks, guys.
Yep. Have a good one.